নমস্কার। বিশ্বে শান্তি সাথে
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
So everybody, thank you so very, very much who has come and joined us in the room today. I think for those people who don't know, just a little bit of context in terms of who we are, in terms of the Interstellar Foundation. So if anybody has heard of the Voyager Golden Record, that was sort of a part of the NASA Voyager missions in the 1970s, where a gentleman called Carl Sagan and Francis Drake put together what is called essentially the Golden Record. And that Golden Record went onto the side of the spacecraft. And that Golden Record was an attempt to try and essentially explain to whoever found the spacecraft who humanity was and who the human species was. And that particular spacecraft left the solar system in 2018 and will be traveling around the Milky Way galaxy for, we think, about 4 billion years. And that record would still be playable for that particular time. So we kind of come together and we put together messages that go to space, and we've got our first mission that's going to be landing on the moon. And for me, I think one of the most interesting parts of the project, and I think what we do as well, is the idea of sort of the representation of ourselves as a species. And then we also like to think about things, I particularly like having conversations about topics that we think are going to be sort of universal in their actual true sense of the word, as in completely universal across the whole universe. Context is a really kind of important part of what we do. So for our first speaker, in this group, Jason has kindly offered to take us through some stuff, and real sort of a big thank you for that, Jason.
So my background, I run a philosophy podcast and YouTube channel with Mark Oppenheimer. We co-host it. It's called Brain in a Vat. And before that, I got my PhD in philosophy from Wits University in South Africa. So it's going to be philosophy heavy, but hopefully accessible to everyone. So the topic that I want to chat about is social groups. And the question I really want to ask is, if we were to encounter an alien, how would that interaction go? And how should that inform how we represent ourselves on a golden record? How should we represent ourselves to other species? So I want to consider a thought experiment. We send a golden record to the stars, and the golden record gets successfully taken up by just one alien. He encounters our golden record and he comes to Earth. So the lone alien arrives and he touches down in the middle of a Trump rally. So right now it's election season. He touches down in the middle of one of Donald Trump's rallies. Remember, he's a lone alien, and this lone alien has never encountered a multiplicity of beings before. So he's lived all his life alone as a single alien. Maybe upon his birth, he encountered others of his species, but the contact was very brief. It was pretty much meaningless to him. And so he's lived his entire life alone, roaming the stars. So he touches down in the middle of this Trump rally, and he tries to make sense of what's going on. Thankfully, he has a universal translator, and he's able to understand our language pretty quickly. But there's certain parts of our language that don't seem to make any sense to him. So he asks us what it is that's going on at this rally, and we explain certain things. We say, well, that guy over there, his name is Donald Trump. He's a presidential candidate. He's running for office. He's the head of a political party, and he's opposed to the Democrats. And the problem is that whenever we mention certain terms to this alien, his universal translator can't make sense of them. And the terms that we keep mentioning that just don't make any sense to this alien are social terms. So it understands when you say that's Donald Trump, it understands that those words refer to that man. It understands that he's standing on a podium, but it doesn't understand what you mean when you say that he's a presidential candidate, that he's running for president or for office, or he's the head of a political party. It doesn't understand what you mean by a political party, because this alien has lived its entire life alone. it's never encountered social structures before. It doesn't know what social groups are or roles within social groups. So we start to describe and explain to this alien why social groups matter to us and how important they are in our lives. And we say that, well, social groups make up a huge part of the human experience. There's political groups, for example, the Republicans that are busy meeting for Donald Trump's rally. Those Republicans they function within a country, the United States. We have religious groups. There's a lot of Christians at this rally. There's a strong focus in Donald Trump's speeches on family. People within the crowd are friends. They're part of friendships. And there's communities involved. So there's all these social groups that seem to make up the structure of our experience. Now, a question that the alien asks is, well, I'm an individual alien. And I can imagine other individuals like me, other individual aliens, but we don't consider ourselves part of social groups. We don't consider ourselves part of communities, families, political structures, societies, economies. What is the difference between the way that us, the aliens individually, how we organize ourselves, and how you guys, humans, organize yourselves? It seems like the difference is that the alien species are just a mere aggregate of individuals. There's a whole bunch of individual aliens that don't interact or cohere in a very coherent way. They don't cohere in a robust way. They're just a mere aggregate of individual aliens. They're not a social group. Why the alien says, when we look at these Republicans in this town square, do you think that they form a social group? Why don't we just think of them as a mere aggregate of individuals who are standing in this town square as individuals, but not as members of a group? Another example would be, consider the difference between the set of all individuals who have brown shoes versus Republicans. So the set of all individuals who have brown shoes, we wouldn't say is a social group. Why? Well, we'll talk about why in a moment, but it seems just intuitively like if you were to think of the set of all human beings on Earth right now who have brown shoes, we wouldn't consider them a social group in the same way that we would consider Republicans to be a social group. And here's 3 features that social groups seem to have that mere aggregates of individuals don't have. So the one is that social groups then can persist through time and change. So over time, Republicans have lost members and gained other members, but it's still the Republican Party. So it's the same party, it's the same social group, even though it changes its membership. Now, what's interesting is that sets can't do this. So as soon as an individual member of a set enters or leaves, it's a different set. So a mere aggregate of individuals would change every time one individual steps in or out of that aggregate. But a social group can persist through time and change. Another difference is that a social group can act together. So what could be happening, perhaps when this alien arrives, is that everyone in the town square is chanting, Trump, 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 Trump for president, Trump for president. So they're chanting together, they're acting together, they're not acting as individuals, at least according to the people who explained to the alien what's happening here. It seems like the group as a whole is acting. And a third difference is that groups, it seems, can be morally responsible for their actions. So we might want to say that Republicans did something good or something bad, but we wouldn't want to say that a set of individuals did something good or something bad. Remember the people with brown shoes. We wouldn't want to say that people with brown shoes are morally responsible for something or can act together. What we would say is each of the individuals who wear brown shoes, each of them could be morally responsible for something, but the set as a whole, the collection of the mere aggregate of people with brown shoes, that mere aggregate wouldn't be responsible. It's the individuals within the mere aggregate that are responsible. But social groups are different. Social groups, it seems, can be morally responsible for their actions as a whole in ways that no particular individual in the group is responsible. The group as a whole could be responsible for things that no particular individual in the group is responsible. Now, this is very mysterious to the alien. It says, I don't really understand what you're talking about when you talk about social groups. When I look out over this field at all these individuals who are at the Trump rally, I just see individuals. I don't see a group. I can't perceive a group directly. I can't experience a group. I just experience a mere aggregate of individuals. Why is it you think that this is a social group and not just a mere aggregate? And specifically, there's two hard questions that humans would have to answer to this alien. There's two hard questions. The one is, what makes a person a member of a group? So, for example, let's say you've got this collection of individuals who are chanting for Donald Trump. We'd want to say, well, these are Republican supporters. Okay, fine. But suppose there's an individual who's walking among them and he is responsible for security for the event. So maybe he's part of the security team, and we'd say, well, is he a Republican? The alien might ask, is he a Republican? And we'd say, well, no, that person's not a Republican. He's just an individual among the group. So the alien would ask, well, what makes a person a member of the group as opposed to not a member of the group? A second question the alien might ask is, how can the group persist despite changes in its membership? In other words, even if one person leaves the rally, the Republican support is still that group. Republicans are still Republicans, even if one person changes their mind halfway through the rally, or if another person joins. The Republican Party can persist through time despite changes in membership. This second question is a very interesting question, but I don't want to discuss it here. I'm going to just discuss the first question. What makes a person a member of a group? Which seems like a really simple question, seems like it should have a simple answer, but it actually turns out to be very hard to answer. So there's a philosopher named Margaret Gilbert, and she's provided what I think is the best answer to this question. I don't think it's the right answer, because I don't think there is a right answer, but I think it's the best of the wrong answers. So Margaret Gilbert says this. She says, when we talk about a group and we talk about a person belonging to the group as a member, we're talking about three things happening together. Firstly, that person self-identifies as a member of the group. Secondly, others in the group agree with that self-identity. Other people in the group agree that that person is a member of the group. So in other words, there's corroboration. And thirdly, there's awareness on the part of that member about the other people who agree in turn that they're a member of the group. So I'll give you an example just to make this simpler, but remember these three components: self-identity, corroboration, and awareness. So why is Donald Trump a Republican? Well, Margaret Gilbert would say the following. Donald is a Republican if and only if Donald identifies as a Republican, so he believes he's a Republican. Other members of the group recognize Donald as Republican. And thirdly, Donald recognizes other members of the group as Republican. So you've got self-identity, corroboration, and awareness. If you have these three features, according to Margaret Gilbert, you've got a group. But there's two problems. So you'll notice this among philosophers. We constantly find problems with everything. We solve things only to find further problems. There are two problems with Margaret Gilbert's solution to the alien's question, what makes a person a member of the group? Two problems. The first one is what I call the big group problem, and the second problem is circularity. So the big group problem. Well, remember, for corroboration to happen, the other members of the group, in other words, other members of the Republican group, need to recognize Donald Trump as a Republican. So that's the corroboration element. And the third element is awareness. Donald Trump also needs to recognize those other members as Republican. And corroboration creates these two features, corroboration and awareness. They generate a problem in large groups, this big group problem. consider how many registered Republican voters there are. As of March 2024, there were 35.7 million Republican voters registered. Now, if corroboration and awareness are both fulfilled, what you would need is that each and every Republican would need to recognize each and every other Republican as a Republican. So, yes, it's true, maybe all of them recognize Donald Trump as a Republican, although even that might be false. You might find that there are some Republicans who denounce Donald Trump. But let's just assume that all Republicans are on board and they agree that Donald Trump is a Republican. It's certainly not the case that awareness is fulfilled. It's not the case that Donald Trump would know about each and every one of the other 35.7 million registered Republican voters and recognize them as Republican. So awareness would not be fulfilled in Donald Trump's case. And when we consider not Donald Trump, but any other given Republican, corroboration would not be fulfilled. In other words, it would not be the case that every single other 35.7 million registered Republican voters would recognize that particular person as a Republican. So this view that Margaret Gilbert has of groups might make sense for a small group where everyone knows about every other member, but in large groups, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, there's a second problem, and the second problem is circularity. So circularity is a problem that philosophers moan about, and when you're trying to define a concept, what you don't want to do is you don't want to include that concept in its definition, because otherwise you're defining a concept in terms of itself. And if you do that, you're not actually telling anybody more about what that concept is. That definition's not a good concept. If I were to ask you, what is snow? And you say to me, well, snow is snow. Well, that's not very helpful. I'd say, well, I knew that. I knew that snow is snow. I need to get more information about what snow is. You can't tell me that what snow is snow. You need to give me more information that doesn't include the word snow in the definition. So why do I say that Margaret Gilbert's account is circular? Well, remember self-identity, one of the criteria, that if a person is a member of a group, they need to identify as a member of that group. So what does it mean for Donald Trump to be a Republican? Donald Trump would need to identify as Republican. Well, that's not very helpful because now we're defining Republican in terms of Republican. And similarly, corroboration and awareness both include the term Republican in their definition. So for corroboration, other group members would need to recognize Donald as a Republican. But again, we want to define what a Republican is. And awareness, Donald would need to recognize other members in the group as Republicans. But we're trying to find out what Republicans are. Now, both of these problems, according to Margaret Gilbert, she's aware of these problems and she proposes a solution. The solution is very interesting. The solution is to replace the mention of Republicans with certain descriptions or features, and I'll call those D. So I'm going to say the set of descriptions or features of the person that we're going to mention, that set is going to be abbreviated by D. So now the self-identity criterion becomes X identifies as having descriptions D. So Donald self-identifies as Republicans when Donald self-identifies as having certain properties or features, or descriptions. And what would those be? We'll discuss those in a moment. Like what would the content of D be? We'll discuss those in a moment. But the idea is you'll see whenever we would have said Republican in this definition of what a Republican is, instead we'll remove the word Republican and substitute it for a set of features or a set of descriptions. So corroboration, other members recognize Donald as having certain description, certain features, and others, and Donald recognizes others as having those features. So what would those features be? What would those properties be? This is the very difficult question. What are the features that are universal to and only apply to Republicans? Is it their view on immigration? Is it their view on guns? Is it their view on religion? Is it their economic views? And the problem is, it doesn't seem like we can answer this question well. So some people join the Republican Party on one particular issue. They join the Republican Party because they don't want immigrants. So they're anti-immigration. But others join because they're pro-guns. Others join because they're pro-religion. Others join because they want a freer market. So it seems like if you were to mention one of these as being the core description of a Republican, it would apply to some Republicans, but not all Republicans. It's going to be impossible to find a feature or a property of a person that guarantees that they're a Republican and nothing else. There's going to be people who are anti-guns and Republican. There's going to be people that are atheists and Republican. It's impossible to find one feature or set of features that is possessed by all Republicans and nobody else. Now, this points to a much larger problem for the group view, what I call the group view, the view that there are social groups. And I want to discuss very briefly two other examples, very controversial examples of groups, as if Donald Trump wasn't controversial enough. So the one example is race and the other one is gender. The problem is when we try to find a set of descriptions that are possessed by everyone of a particular race and nobody else, we can't find them. So we can't find sufficient genetic or universally experienced differences between racial group members. There's no set of genes that guarantees that you'll be black and not white. There's no set of experiences that every and only black people have. Some black people are going to have different genes. Some black people are going to have different experiences. You can't homogenize people in this way. And as a result, over the last few years, more and more people are becoming race eliminativists. They don't believe in the existence of race because we can't find descriptions that satisfy every person of a particular race and nobody else. Another example, gender. What is a woman? Well, highly contentious, highly controversial. Why? Because it's entirely unclear who is in or out of the group. Every person seems to have a view on this. Everyone, if you ask a given person, they'll say, I'm 100% sure that this person is a woman or this person is not a woman. But everyone seems to disagree on what they're so sure about. If you ask someone what are the descriptions that satisfy all and only women, they're going to give you different answers. And how do we decide which one is right? There is no universally agreed upon set of descriptions that describe all and only women. So here's my alternative. Instead of trying to tell the alien that we have these social groups, instead of trying to convince the alien that we have races and genders and political parties and families and countries, instead what we should do is say that social groups don't exist at all. We should eliminate social groups. We should stop thinking about ourselves as being members of political families and parties and classes and religions and races, etc., and instead think of ourselves as individuals. We are just individuals. And my view is that the theory that there are social groups is radically false. It's like witchcraft theory. So witchcraft is an explanation for how the world works. It's a folk theory. It's a theory about how the world works, and we've over time realized that witchcraft is false. It's wrong. It gives incorrect explanations about how the world works. We also have outdated scientific theories that we have realized over time are just false. They're radically false. Phlogiston was a theory about the way heat works. That the idea was, in ancient times, they believed that objects held within them this stuff called phlogiston, and that when you heated objects up to a certain point, this phlogiston was released. And so the heat emanated from that object through this substance called phlogiston. We now know that that is radically false. Throughout the era of humanity, we have had these false theories about the way the world works. I think that the view that there are social groups is just another one of these false theories. So what I want to do is to replace social theories, false social theories, with individualistic theories. Rather than talking about Republicans, you should just talk about a bunch of individuals. There are a whole lot of individuals that differ in their views, but there are certain views that some of them have in common, and we can talk about the interestingness of those views. I would not talk about Republicans as a whole because there's just too much variation between Republicans. I want to say one last thing. to be fair to social theorists, that Gilbert is not the only social theorist around. There are other games in town. So there's game theory by Lewis. And Lewis said that if you want to understand what a social group is, you should understand it according to game theory. Basically, a bunch of individuals comprise a social group if they coordinate their efforts in a certain way to achieve an end. And then there's Searle, John Searle. He is a social constructionist. He argues that a social group is a collection of individuals who construct themselves according to certain construction rules. And he gave an explanation for how those rules need to be formulated. Both of these accounts, I think, have problems, and they're not as good as Gilbert's account, but I just wanted you to be aware of both of those accounts in case you say that I've made the eliminativists' argument a little bit too easy. So yeah, that's all I have to say about social groups. I don't think they exist.
I think, in terms of like how we come together as a group as well, I think this kind of really is a great sort of starting point, because as a collective group, we're gonna need to make some decisions. So I think in terms of a purpose as well, I think it's a really fantastic starting point, because I think a couple of things that I think kind of came up just listening to you speak, when kind of starting this project as well, the idea of trying to describe things, you kind of really get stuck quite quickly. Even if you start to sort of describe to an alien what is alive, what is not alive, is a virus alive, there's a lot of non-agreement in sort of these particular things. I think, listening to sort of what you're saying as well, it does make me think of there's Earth, and there's Earth 1.1, and on Earth 1 is basically all of us, and we live in this particular place. With version 1.1, they distinguish each other by tall and short. And if you explain to somebody what the distinction is by tall and short, you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And they're, well, like, it does. You can see this person is taller than that person is shorter. And that's how we distinguish, how we come together as social groups. I'm gonna open it up to the group.
Thanks for the great and interesting talk, Jason. I enjoyed that, as always. So I want to give you some additional ammunition against Gilbert, and then ask a question about how revisionary your proposal is at the end of the day, right? So if citizens count as social groups by most people's lights, which I think it does, then the awareness condition would fail. Because, for instance, you get American citizenship if you're born in America, and American babies are American, but they're definitely not aware that they're American. So it might work reasonably well with political parties, but when I think you try to generalize it to other things that we would count as social groups, we would run into lots of issues there. So that's the additional ammunition. But here's my question about how revisionary this is. So I might be sympathetic to the claim that there's no social groups, in the sense that there's not an additional thing called a group that we say has like ontological status over and above the status of each individual member. But of course, referring to certain sets of things, or people in many cases, or animals, that matters practically in a way where it just makes sense linguistically to sort of refer to them as a group, even if what it really is like a bunch of individuals that share some common feature that's relevant for the conversation here. And it's just a sort of shorthand. So Republicans is like a shorthand way to refer to a certain set of people at a time. That would just make this kind of conversation impossible otherwise. Okay. So you said one difference between social groups and sets of individuals is that groups can persist through change, but sets can't. I say, okay, well, what if I say there are social groups that don't have a distinct ontological status? And what we're really doing is referring to a set of sets. So when I talk about Republicans, I'm talking about the set of people who are registered as Republican over time. So you can just take a snapshot at each moment in time of the people that are registered Republican. And then when I'm referring to the group of Republicans, I'm talking about that set of sets over time. And it would just be too cumbersome to not act as if they're, not just refer to them as a group of Republicans, even if they don't have a distinct ontological status. So anyway, here's the question. If we revise our language to talk about sets of sets in this way, it seems to not commit to social groups in the sense that you think is problematic. But then is that really that revisionary from what we do already? How radical is this? How radically different is this from what we actually do?
Firstly, it's a very clever idea. I've never heard this floated, the set of sets idea. So that's a very smart response. Okay, so two reasons why I don't think it would function the same way as a social group. So the one is that, firstly, sets can't act or take responsibility for their actions. So even if you had a set of sets, I assume that also couldn't act or take responsibility for its actions. So you would still have something missing, a very important element missing. How many times do you switch on the news and you hear the Democrats did X, the Republicans did Y, Russia did Z, Ukraine did B? It seems like all of those would have to fall away. Instead, you'd have to say, Putin said X. And that's quite different from Russia did X. Because when you try to hold someone responsible for what Putin does, you wouldn't hold Russia responsible. You'd only hold Putin responsible. It also means that the Republicans couldn't win the election. It would be strange to think about what an election is. It would be strange to think of Donald Trump as the president of the United States or Joe Biden as the president of the United States. If there is no United States, there's just a set of individuals that keeps changing. So there's then a set of individuals at one time, a set of individuals at another time, a set of individuals at another time that together represent the United States. That seems to be backward looking, not forward looking. So there've been all these sets of individuals that comprise the citizenry of the United States. Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States going forward. So what are you saying? That there's a set that will form in time that will become part of the set of sets, and Donald Trump will lead that set of sets? I mean, it's cumbersome, right? It's weird to talk about in that way, but it's weird. It's weird. It's weird because it seems like what you're talking about is backward facing, whereas an election is forward facing. And let's say America went to war, who would be responsible for that? Like, what would that mean? It's not the case that everyone in that set of sets goes to war. What would it mean? And who would be responsible for that, for the outcome of that? If they were to do bad things, if they were to commit war crimes, who would be responsible? So you're still missing responsibility. Maybe you've gotten persistence in there. You've snuck in persistence. But I'm not even sure you have snuck in persistence, because remember, a set ceases to exist the moment that set changes its membership. You're saying that there's a set of sets. So you've got the set of sets changing its membership every time a set moves in or out of that set. Or you're saying they're always in there. You're looking at a globalist, like, okay, so 4-dimensional block of time over the full duration of time. Okay, maybe you've snuck in persistence. That's very clever. But I don't think you've got responsibility or action.
Do you need to accept that there's group responsibility in order to accept that there's social groups? Because I thought, like, it's true that lots of them do, but maybe you could say, well, yeah, we should do away with group responsibility. We really press it. Like, of course, people aren't responsible for things that they can't do. There's individuals within the group that are responsible, but they're still social groups. They still exist.
The problem with that is it seems fundamental to our notion of value that we ascribe to groups. So when we think about groups and the importance they play in our lives or in our identities, at least our false beliefs about the importance they play in our lives, they have that value because we think that the group did something amazing at some point. The group achieved something. The group represented something. The group created something. We ascribe value to groups because we give them, we think that what they produce has value. But it's on this view, on my view, and even on the set of set views, the group doesn't produce anything. There's just individuals. Like, why would you be patriotic, for example? Patriotism would make no sense, right? And you'd be okay with that, scrap patriotism. But religion would also be valueless, as a religious group would be valueless. I mean, do you basically just agree with all of these implications? But those implications are why people subscribe to groups. You just might not have strong group identity in your particular life, but so many people do. And it's because of the value that groups hold to them, and that value derives from the actions or the creations of that group.
So I've got two thoughts. The one is whether we can modify Gilbert's account. So I think you're right to point out that in the big group case, it's not possible for everybody to actually know who all the members are. And the other members then can't recognize you as an individual. And as you say, you've got certain things like children who just lack that capacity. So we could modify it to say that if they were to ask you a series of questions, they could find out whether you had the sufficient descriptors, being D, and then say, now that I know this of you, I can find out that you're a group, that you're a member of the group, like you're showing me your ID card through this exercise, this sort of theoretical exercise. So in other words, you could say we're disposed under the right conditions to find out your identity. And then on the second front, it might very well be the case that there is vagueness in groups, but there's vagueness in other areas in life. So if we think about the sororities problem, if I have one grain of sand and I keep adding a single grain of sand, at some point I now have a heap of sand, but you can't tell me the point at which we've reached that heap. And so it might be the case that there are going to be people who we say, this person is very clearly a Republican. They hold all of the beliefs that are associated with Republicans, and there's no ambiguity here whatsoever. And then we sort of take away a belief set or a descriptor one by one, and we get to a vagueness, and we say, this person's Republican-ish. We're not sure. But just because we have the vagueness at the edges, and we might very well have that in the case of sex and race as well, that there's enough people who can sort of say, well, this person is clearly a woman, this person is debatably a woman, this person is definitely not a woman, that we have groups with fuzzy lines around them, and that might be sufficient for the alien to understand what we have.
I like both of those points. Okay, so the first one, it leads to what I call the dispositional refinement of her account. So the idea is that it's not the case that every member knows every other member, but they would know every other member as members. They would recognize them if they were to ask a series of questions and those members were to answer them in a certain way. So there's a disposition to know them or recognize them as members. I like that account, but it's still going to face the same problem of what those questions would have to be. So it's the same problem as defining the descriptions or the features of a person. So the one you mentioned was showing your ID card. That seems like an ironclad descriptor, but a whole bunch of Republicans won't have a Republican ID card. So what are we going to use in those cases? Well, now you have this problem of, are you going to ask them about their views on guns? Is it religion? Is it their views on family? Is it their views on economy? Is it their views on race? Is it their views on gender? Like, which of those is it? And how do we prioritize those? How do we weight those? It's the same problem, basically. I think it just sets the problem one back. The vagueness is a good point. It seems like there are vague objects in the world, like piles of rocks. What constitutes a pile? Is 2 rocks a pile? Is 3 rocks a pile? 4, 5? At some point we can say it's a pile. Just before that, it's not. That doesn't really make sense. So it's vague. Okay, fine. But the difference between piles of rocks and groups is that social groups are supposed to be agents. And agents have to take moral responsibility for their actions. It doesn't seem like you could have a vague agent in the sense of we're not sure if it's an agent or not. It seems like something, if it's going to be morally responsible for its actions as an agent, it either is or it isn't, because we're either going to punish it or not. You can't vaguely punish it. So because the stakes are binary, 1, 0, I take it that the ontology has to be 1, 0. The stakes when it comes to piles of rocks are not 1, 0. They're not binary. It doesn't matter if we mischaracterize a pile as just a mere aggregate of stones or a pile. It's not going to make a difference to our moral normative world. but it is going to make a big difference whether we punish a president of a country or the whole country, or demand remuneration from a whole country or just from one individual in the group, or so where moral responsibility lies seems really important, and so we would want like a 1-0 answer, a binary answer.
So just a quick rebuttal on that front. So we can imagine, let's say there's a mob of people who are engaging in a violent riot, and we say these rioters are responsible for burning down the town. Okay, and we arrest just the whole block of people. And so we have a prima facie view about their moral responsibility, and then we start to fine grain our assessment for the individuals, because we could take the view you punish everybody, everybody gets 10 years, or we say, what was your level of participation in this group? So you've got a kind of mere presence based on your vicinity, but then we say things like, well, we've got video footage of you, wielding, the burning lantern and setting a light to this guy and his building, versus this other guy who's sort of sitting on the sidelines watching but not condemning anybody, versus someone actively disassociating from the group. And so we could be, let's say, loose-grained in who counts, but then fine-grained when it comes to the moral responsibility. And so that might give us our cake and eat it.
It's very interesting. Obviously I want to say in a case like that where you've got a mob doing something, that you don't punish the mob, you punish each individual depending on what they in particular did. The question I'd want to ask is, are you missing anything by using my method? Are you gaining anything by first saying that's a person that's in the mob, that's a person that's not? On my view, you'll get a much better outcome, a much more accurate, fair, just outcome if you were to punish each person according to what they did. There might be epistemic problems. There might be that you just don't know. You don't have cameras, so you can't know what happened. And so a shorthand would be to say, okay, the mob did it, you were part of the mob, you get punished. Maybe. But that maybe isn't justice. Maybe it is, as opposed to doing nothing, punishing nobody. So there are these interesting cases, but those all seem to rely on epistemic problems. They all rely on, we're not sure what happened at the time, so we'll use the mob as a shorthand. If you were to do away with the epistemic problems and say we had perfect camera footage of what was going on, surely the right thing to do would be to dispense with the notion of the mob altogether and just look at the individual cases involved. So I'm saying that if you were to perfectly understand the world, a perfect understanding of everything that's going on, if we were to give a golden record over to aliens that perfectly represents everything about human society, there should be no social group terms on that record. That would be a perfect explanation of what's happening. The moment you insert a group term, what you're doing is inserting a shorthand that almost always will involve an inaccuracy and a homogeneity somewhere that isn't accurate. You're assuming that everyone in that group has a certain characteristic or set of characteristics, and there will always be exceptions. So if you were to give a perfect explanation, a full explanation, suppose this golden record had a really, really, really high storage capacity, data storage capacity, and you were to perfectly describe our world, our human society, well, I don't want to say society, but our human existence, you should not mention any social group terms.
Nice to see you, Jason.
too.
Fantastically clear talk, and of course, really interesting. I don't have an account of what a group is or why we should believe in one yet, but I think I do have a move to consider when we instead focus on the question of how to determine who counts as a member of a group. And if that, if my account is plausible, then maybe we can run with it and pull a group ontology out of it eventually, but I haven't gotten that far. But thinking about the case of Republicans, you are treating membership as all or nothing, and you're supposing that to be a member of a group, all members must share the same characteristics. And I guess I question both of those suppositions. What I'm inclined to say about the Republican case, and at least many other group membership cases, I don't think all, I think it's probably worth differentiating different types of groups more than we have in this conversation, but at least for Republicans and a number of other cases I'd be willing to go to bat for, it looks to me as though membership is a matter of degree. So it's not all or nothing. Instead, there is a cluster of properties that can be shared to a certain extent. And the more you exhibit those properties, the more of a member you are. So I'd be inclined to say of the Republican case, for example, you're more Republican the more you want government out of the boardroom. The more you want government in the bedroom, the more you are in favor of gun rights, the more you are hard on crime, the more you favor the death penalty, the more you call yourself a Republican, the more you vote Republican. We can add on more properties. If we make this move, then it's a matter of degree. And I think it's plausible to say, oh, he's a true Republican. He's a genuine Republican, which signals that, well, that person exhibits quite a lot of these traits. And conversely, we might want to say, well, he's not a real Republican, even though technically he might exhibit some of the features. That's looking good to me. What do you think about that as a move for membership, at least?
Yeah, I think Gilbert actually mentioned something like this in her discussion, but she doesn't go into any detail. Mark has also presented this solution to me in discussion previously, sort of a cluster account of the descriptions, and then just trying to find either a cutoff. So you could have a binary account where if you meet 6 out of the 11, then you're a Republican, or it's just a matter of degree. Yeah. So Mark is represented as a binary account, and I'm not convinced because that seems arbitrary. But yeah, I like this account of percentages. Okay, so I have a question for you. Could the head of a group, so it seems to be the most Republican of all Republicans, could the head of the group lack some of the features? And could there be other members in the group who have more than the head of the group?
Sure. Intuitively, that sounds right to me.
But it's weird, right? You would think that the head of the group is the most groupy member there is, right?
The head has been elected or appointed, or there's been some kind of role to play, but that doesn't seem, I'm willing to bite the bullet there. I don't think you could have truer Republicans than President Trump.
Yeah, I think it's weird though, because it's like you can imagine President Trump, if he becomes president, or prior President Trump, lacking quite a few of the beliefs. He might just say certain things in public because it'll help him get elected. But if anyone is a Republican, it should be Donald Trump. So I like the idea of grades of a group membership in principle, but I don't think that beliefs are how you get there. So why? Well, 2 reasons. The one is I think I know that you're willing to bite the bullet on this counterexample, but I don't think that represents adequately what we would see and the way people would feel about group membership. So if I'm looking at a group, if I want to find the quintessential member of that group, I'd look at the head of that group. They are expressing the views of that group. When Donald Trump stands up in a debate, he's representing the views of Republicans. And so, it seems odd to me that the head of a group could lack some of those views. So there are other ways of getting to groupiness that's vague membership. So you could, or that not vague, but gradiented. So you could get there. One suggestion that's been floated in the literature is you look at the interrelationships between the group members, and whoever has more connection points than that person is more groupy, is a core member compared with others. So there are ways of sort of getting there. But I still worry. Why? Well, because again, the stakes involved seem binary. So let's say you're a German in 1940s. and you're an SS officer. Are you responsible for what happened? Are you responsible for the death of the Jews that Germany killed? Are you responsible? Well, the answer, I don't know. What's the answer? Is the answer yes, no, binary, or do you think it's gradiented? It seems like the gradiented solution wouldn't be gradiented according to the number of the views that you held. It would be gradiented according to the actions that you performed. So if you are going to give a gradiented response, it seems like the ontology is not representing the morality, the normativity. A lot of the time we have 1-0s when it comes to group membership. So who are you going to vote for? Republican, Democrat. You could vote for someone else, but it's still a 1 or 0. It's binary. You're either voting for them or you're not. And maybe it's a problem with our current discourse that people are highly polarized, that you're in or you're out, maybe. But that does seem to be the way that we think about groups. Are you a member of your family? It seems yes or no, right?
Jason, when you make that move and you start thinking about the stakes or responsibility, I think the question has changed. Now we're not debating who's a member or what counts as being a member. We're now discussing something more like, do groups exist, or how do we hold groups responsible? And I think that's a different issue.
There are different issues, and you could theoretically have different responses. So you could theoretically say, here's my account of groups. My account of groups is maybe Mark's account that it's vague, or your account that there's a gradient, there's a percentage level that you're a Republican. But we want our ontology to support our morality. So we want to make sense of when we blame a group for something, we want to make sense of that in terms of its ontology. If our ontology, if the way we understand the existence of the group and the metaphysics of that group is so different to our understanding of the way we punish that group, then it seems like we have no good reason to punish the group. So I always feel like if you're going to have a morality about groups, your ontology needs to support that morality. If it doesn't, then you have to drop your morality. You have to drop your punishment.
So I actually have a question about aliens, but before we move on, I just want to address that last point. It seems like we could have room in here for the idea of multiple binding points into an organization, and you could have that as an hierarchical thing, like there were levels of membership, or you could just have, as of the case, like you might actually be a card-carrying member of a party. Some states do have that, or you might be registered by this, or your involvement with the family is, do you live here? Do you come to the meetings? Do you call mom on the weekends? So I do feel like that might be, now that 1 is you're not in and 2 is you do all of them, but you have people who might do, to use a YouTube analogy from our ecosphere, you watch the show a lot, but you didn't actually subscribe. Or you're a subscriber, but you haven't joined Patreon. Or you do see it on Patreon, but you listen to the podcast version we have over on SoundCloud or Spotify or something like that. So you do have the kind of multiple binding points I think would fit better with the idea that there's a lot of different potential avenues for how you include someone. Going to the alien one, though, is say, of course, with aliens, we can't assume they're going to be social, or they might be a hive mind. It might be some huge group, Skynet or singular mind that's gone on there. But if they are a social organization of any kind, if they are a species or something like that, can't we assume they are going to have some kind of social groupings, and they are going to be able to actually kind of spot themselves or us inside their own definitions? And, as an example, we obviously have differences how we regard groups between cultures, but it does seem like group identity is something that carries on across cultural boundaries without too much of confusion. And presumably there was a kind of a biological basis for that, but wouldn't we tend to assume they would have one too?
Yeah, I like both of those points. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is there could be multiple sufficient ways for being part of a group, but none is necessary. So an example is you can be Jewish because your mother was Jewish, or you could be Jewish because you convert to being Jewish. You could be Republican because you got the Republican ID card. I don't know if there's such a thing, but the Republican ID card, or because
For
you
some
attended a
states,
rally, or because you voted, or so there's all these different entry methods. None is necessary, but all are sufficient. Each of them is sufficient.
Each of them was sufficient, but only to a degree. So, like how well connected you are to a group, you can be seen as being on the fringes or the boundaries of a group, or inactive in a group. And, a social group you might have not attended in years, but you pop in occasionally, and so people still think of you as part of it, but not entirely part of it. So there is a
Okay, I understand.
of involvement.
So it's supporting Thad's idea that you could have these gradients of groupiness, of membershipness. You're all the way in, you're a bit of the way in, you're just on the fringe.
Right, but with the caveat that obviously a lot of folks are not going to value, they're not going to look at this particular bucket as valuable as this other bucket. You never call mom, so you're not part of this family. But your sister says, well, that's not as important. We don't like to talk, but you come to all the get-togethers.
So you're saying even when it comes to like families, that could be the case. You could be somewhat part of the family, more part of the family, very part of the family. Yeah, that's interesting. Just on the family example, there might be cases that that theory gives the wrong result. So like a baby, an infant that's born into the family, that infant seems to be extremely part of the family. Like it's absolutely integral to the family, core to the family. The whole family's behavior forms around that for the next while, for the next few years. They talk about it all the time. It's really crucial, but it lacks so many of those other entry points. So it doesn't call mom often. It doesn't it doesn't stand up in town meetings and say, I'm a member of this family. It lacks a lot of the other entry points or binding points that you're talking about. So that theory might give the wrong result in the baby case. Something else that I wanted to say about Thad's idea and your idea is it might water down the notion of a group so much that it's not giving us anything extra that individuals aren't in our explanations.
I think, because I tend to agree with you on that, is the idea that to some degree, how part of a group you are is how much the other people are recognizing you as part of it. Not necessarily a majority, but a large portion do. So if everyone's got their different buckets for what qualifies and how important they are, for some people that calls worth 3 times as much, is it sufficient to say, well, I met 20 different people's systems out of 40, they all view me as a member for different reasons? Is that valid?
Yeah. So this is the networking or the relationship idea that if someone is at the nexus of lots of different networking points, they're more crucial to the group. They more of a member than other people. So everyone in the Republican Party knows about Donald Trump, but very few people in the Republican Party know about Joe at the back of the rally, who's standing at the back of the rally. So Donald is much more crucial to the group's organization, much more of a member than the guy standing at the back of the rally. There are some very interesting counterexamples to that way of creating a gradient for membershipness. So there's interesting cases around hermits. So you've got a hermit. Let's say, for example, someone is a Christian missionary. So Christian missionary, he really does, he buys into everything. He buys into the Bible. He believes in God. He believes the word of Jesus. He wants to proselytize others. He really subscribes to everything that a missionary should subscribe to. It seems like he is really a member of the group, but he also happens to be a hermit. So he moves off to a distant country, to a distant city. Maybe he's very old. All his friends have died. No one remembers him. He's proselytizing on his own, unsuccessfully, say. He's too old to proselytize. No one can understand his speech anymore. But he really is a Christian. He is if you were to rank who forms who is a core Christian, he's a core Christian. He really devotes his life to Christianity. But he's a very small he in fact isn't even a nexus. So no one recognizes him as a Christian because no one encounters him. No one has a memory of him, no one living. He's on his own. So you've got the lack of relationship. He's not a nexus point. And so he, according to that position, that nexus, the nexusness of someone is their membershipness. According to that position, he's hardly a member at all, if at all. Maybe he's not on that position. But our intuition says he's a core member. And so it's giving the wrong result. Thad's view would give the right result on him because he has all the requisite views. But this view wouldn't. The relationship view wouldn't.
Okay, I agree with the benefits of us dropping the idea of group identity as a South African, having lived through a lot of the South African history over the last, say, 40 years. I think I'm going to also bring it back to sort of the idea from an alien's perspective. So from an alien's perspective, we are Earthlings, individuals, but still Earthlings as a collective species from this particular planet who have come together and built cities and economies, and in some way buy into this idea of collecting in these particular ways, in voting and so forth. And if we're having with this maybe conversation with this alien, I think one of the things that I also like to sort of think about is this idea of how would we like to be treated if we're having this as a first conversation with an alien, and there is some sort of a collective sort of community of species from different planets in the universe, and we're then being collectively sort of, if we look at the example of, say, a Vogon highway that would be driven, like that would be, put through Earth, and we need to decide whether Earth is worth keeping and whether the humans are worth keeping on it. How would we like to be treated? Is it from an individual perspective, and do our individual actions deem us to be worthwhile or not? And maybe that kind of comes into like maybe for me, a bit too much of a religious idea of, well, if I'm good in this way, in their idea of what good is, then that would be good. Or is it as a species, do we have value as a species in this sort of universal collective? And it's more of a question than it is a statement in that.
Well, if you watch a lot of Star Trek, that's the narrative. So the narrative is humans are a curious species, but they're also destructive. And Q, in a lot of the Next Generation episodes, this sort of demigod, he assesses the nature of humanity through Jean-Luc Picard's actions. So he puts humanity on trial, and humanity has these abilities, and humanity has these flaws. So it's almost like humanity is personified, and then humanity is assessed. And that's one way we might see the aliens seeing us. I mean, it's entirely possible. And the previous question said, these aliens might be social creatures, and they're perfectly capable of grouping us. But I guess what my argument is that we shouldn't perceive ourselves this way. It's not the case that because one person did something terrible that we all did something terrible, or because one person did something good that we all did something good, or that one person invented something, we all invented something. I think there's enormous variation in the way that humans do things, humans think, humans feel. I mean, we should all be aware of that. Like, we're so different from one another. We're so different. We're all joining this call because we're interested in one thing, which is this golden record. That's what it looks like, right? So I've just said a statement that I think you'd all nod to, but probably that's not true. I think maybe Travis is here because he's a friend of mine and a philosopher and is interested in my view on social groups. Maybe someone else is in this for a different reason. We all have subtle underlying differences, both in our actions and our motivations, and we shouldn't be judged as such. And I'd hope that an alien species that managed to get all the way here, surpass all these amazing technological feats, would be able to appreciate our individuality. And I know that there's been a very big push in recent years to group people. I'm a woman, I'm a man, I'm black, I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm Palestinian, I'm whatever it is, and I'm fighting for this or that. I think it's a very fruitless way of representing ourselves. I think a much more fine-grained, understanding, cooperative approach is to appreciate each person's individuality, what they bring to the table. And I would hope that an alien species could do that, could see us for that there's an amazing inventor, an amazing scientist, amazing philosopher, amazing coordinator like Nick, who brings people together. There's individuals who offer all of these things, and those aliens want to interact with those individuals, as opposed to we want to interact with humanity.
I mean, I do love that. I think coming back to also the group in the sense of this particular group of people, in terms of how we reach consensus, is there a framework for consensus? And then maybe coming back to the point on responsibility, is that when humans come together and reach consensus is there a shared responsibility as a, I'd hate to use the word community, of people that have then taken responsibility in that consensus?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer. It's a really good question. It's something that the original Golden Record was criticized for. Are you representing humanity? Are you representing all of our diversity? I think at the very least, what I would want is I would want a softening of our identities, our group identities, in the way we represent ourselves. I think it would be an error for us to represent ourselves that way to some species that's totally unaware of all of our parochial fights. That you've got this religion fighting with that religion, or this group fighting with that group, this political structure fighting with that political structure. In the pale blue dot scheme of things, zooming all the way out, that all just seems very silly, like very, very silly. And what seems to matter more is just the existence of intelligent life, the capacity of that species, the capacities of that species, and what it's produced.
Jason, I wonder about the implications of your view for understanding animal life. So, there are flocks and there are hives and there are baboon troops. And those seem quite different from a species. You might reject that, but whatever it is, it's not that sort of group. But these things also seem quite different than simply an aggregate of individuals. And so if we're going to describe elements of the natural world with flocks and hives and troops, and we are natural beings who've evolved in a similar dynamic, won't it be important then to account for human nature in terms of groups as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Thad. Some philosophers have tried to understand human social groups in this way. So they've given an account of human social groups as a hive, for example. I don't think that account of groups works for humans, but I want to distinguish between these different types of groups, of apparent groups of animals. So flocks, hives, and troops. Okay, so a troop of baboons is going to have very similar, I'm going to give you very similar arguments against the existence of troops of baboons that I'm going to give to troops of humans, groups of humans. Why? Because Searle talks quite a lot about this. So Searle thinks what makes a group is, it's not what makes a group, but a necessary feature of a group is collective intentionality. So it's this idea of a we. And he references articles, and quite a lot of biologists have written articles agreeing with Searle that baboons can have a we. We hunt. They think that baboons don't think I hunt, I hunt, I hunt, I hunt, all individually. They think we hunt. The same way that humans think we will vote for Trump. Yes, we can. We think that groups of individuals don't just say I plus I plus I, they have a we intentionality, collective intentionality. So on troops, the account I'm going to give of troops is very similar to the account I'm going to give of humans, of human groups. I think it's going to succeed or fail for the same reasons as human groups. Hives and flocks are more interesting. We don't think, as far as I understand, but there may be biologists in this talk who can correct me. As far as I understand, we don't think that flocks or hives can have collective intentionality. We think that they operate as if they do, but they don't actually have collective intentionality. So when the bees generate a hive, so they appear to coordinate their behavior in such a way that they create this structure, it appears like they're coordinating. It appears like they have a group goal, but they don't actually coordinate and they don't actually have a group goal. Instead, what's actually happening there is that each individual bee has pheromones that it sends out and receives, and those pheromones prompt it to act in a certain way. Similarly to when you watch these schools of fish move, It's incredible. It's, you know, the school of fish is approached by a predator, and it moves as if it's one entity. But what's really happening there is that there's no collective intentionality. So there's no thought in each fish's mind that we are a swarm and we must do this. What's actually happening is there's just, each fish is biologically determined to act in a certain way because of its neural structure, and its neural structure dictates that if it sees scales reflecting light in a certain way on one side, it will adjust so that those, you know, that school of fish appears to move as one, but it's not. It's actually just a collection of individual fish. So there's certain animal types that can be very easily understood individualistically. Not easily understood, but can be. You can reduce their behavior down. But the troop is more difficult. So the troop of baboons, they think lions as well. Lions may be capable of troop thought, of collective intentionality.
I would have thought there's just briefly something in between a collective intentionality, a very thick we on the one hand, and then a reduction to features of individuals on the other. And what's in between those are certain relational properties, right? There's certain relationships between these individuals that is a plausible candidate for what constitutes a group.
It's a really good point, and it actually answers the second question that I didn't have a chance to engage in this discussion, which is not what makes the person a member of a group, but what allows the group to persist through time. And one of the answers that people give to that question is there's certain relationships between the members of a group that persist through time, certain types of relationships, even if the individuals having those relationships are swapped out with other individuals. So it's a whole other discussion. But yeah, it's a really good point.
The idea of sort of memes, where groups have particular things that allow those groups to persist on a wider stage of like going out and collecting new group members, or saying other groups are bad or not good. I'm not sure we can just continue. Like, I'm fine just to carry on going, guys. If you guys want to, I'm on the professional Zoom here, so we can kind of go as long as we want. But firstly, Jason, what I will do is probably just end the recording, because we are going to share this with the group as well. Thank you so very, very much. As a sort of starting point, it is a fantastic place, I think, for us to start in this discussion, because I think part of what we're trying to do is firstly figure out how we want to talk about ourselves, and I think this really gets to the core of how we want to represent ourselves in a message, and not just about sort of how we want to represent our philosophy. And it's just an incredibly helpful thing. And I would just like to maybe to extend an invitation to actually bring this talk even to our larger group of participants.
Sure.
Foundation at one of our monthly meetings, because I think
I think it's important, because I've been listening to those talks, and sometimes they're groupy and sometimes they're not. And the ones that are groupy, I often have this thought is, should we be discussing ourselves this way? But the ones that are not groupy seem perfectly applicable to me and perfectly suitable. And this is a methodological approach, and maybe the solution we come up with is not to ban group talk, but to say that it shouldn't be our focus. It should be soft. It should be softer.
I mean, I do love that. I think we have in some ways with these meetings, with the larger meetings, kind of got into this thing of talking about a lot of the work that some of the members are doing, and in some ways kind of gotten away from the core idea of what do we want to send in messages. And I think maybe an idea would be to almost have this as not having like two speakers in this next meeting. We've already got our two speakers, but potentially the following meeting, which is the October meeting, is we'd actually have this as the discussion, and kind of just allow people to kind of, because this is also how we started. When we started the first meetings, we didn't really have speakers. We just had this as these sort of discussion forums of what we want to, what is important to send, and why is it important to send those particular things. If you're watching the recording all the way till this point, well done. Thank you for making it.